It's known as an immigrant-friendly country, and it is America's neighbor to the north. It may have a charismatic prime minister to some, but what lies beneath the surface is our focus. That country, Canada, like many economies around the world, ravaged by COVID-19 pandemic. Here's the PM Trudeau with his stimulus plan announced back in March.
In these extraordinary times, our government is taking extraordinary measures. The measures we're announcing today will provide up to $27 billion in direct support to Canadian workers and businesses, plus $55 billion to meet liquidity needs of Canadian businesses and households through tax deferrals to help stabilize the economy.
Well, yet at that point that you heard, the depth of the problem was really not known. As it progressed, it got worse. For example, Montreal, stripped of the crowds of visitors that usually flock to its sites, to the Grand Prix, to its renowned festivals. Many businesses across the board in Canada were suffering, as you're about to see.
It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting to see the streets so empty. Toronto's kind of like that too, although the patios are filling up now. So you're getting more people on the streets and more cars now. Yeah, I've never seen Montreal so empty.
Hello, welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavita Hawaii. In this week's episode, we will take a look at Canada's economy and some of its weak points like income inequality and how the impact of COVID-19 has had on that economy. Now, don't forget, we always want to hear from you on our show, so why not get in touch with us by visiting our Twitter page using the marker @ED_program. We'd love to hear from you and share your stories, so don't be shy, get in touch, and let us know about the stories that matter to you. Now down to some basic facts about how battered Canada's economy is. In late October, the Governor of the Central Bank of Canada forecast that the economy would not fully recover until sometime in the year 2023. Of course, you need to keep in mind whether a vaccine will come along that would accelerate the pace of the recovery, which at this point, that may have already happened. On the other hand, if the economy weakens amid a second wave of infections, the central bank could, if necessary, cut the already record low interest rates. But will that help people spend money? That's the real question, isn't it? But this message from Prime Minister Trudeau was a reality check on how bad the COVID-19 situation actually is in Canada, something which obviously the government did not anticipate.
Canada has often been seen as a safe haven for immigrants, a multicultural and multinational country, which is actually a combination of indigenous First Nations and waves of immigrants. But when it comes to equality, there seems to be a huge difference between white Canadians and non-whites. One of the major differences is the income gap. At the moment, Canada's income gap is at a record high. Experts say that there are two factors contributing to this growing gap: a widening disparity in labor earnings between high and low-paid workers, and less redistribution. Taxes and benefits also reduce inequality less in Canada than in most countries.
When it comes to Native people, well, like the Palestinians in Western Asia, Native people are indigenous to this territory, and this territory has been taken, in some cases, violently and ruthlessly from the indigenous peoples, and they were pushed out of even citizenship. So there's been a great theft of resources and wealth from the indigenous peoples, and it's been devastating in its effect on people's psychology, their ability to adapt to the current economy.
How bad is Canada's economy doing anyways? Maybe the question should be, prior to the COVID-19, was it underperforming? Well, don't take our word for it. Let's look at the Bank of Canada and what it has done. First, it has said that Canada's financial system is resilient. Yet a closer look reveals that there are high levels of household debt. And you guessed it, money that the bank has lent to households. Now, the central bank has also said that the longer the pandemic affects jobs and incomes, the greater the risk of financial trouble for households and businesses. Basically, that's another way of saying that risks to households, businesses, and markets actually remain. When it comes to businesses, the usual ones are the victims, like businesses in other countries across the world, including transportation, arts and entertainment, for example, accommodation, and food services. Now it's time to look at what has affected Canada's neighbor, the U.S., severely: food insecurity.
Food insecurity is yet another challenge people in less privileged communities face in Canada. As some food banks are forced to close, daycares and schools close also, and paychecks stop. And people of all ages and backgrounds may face food insecurities. For those who were already food insecure, the situation is worse. A meal, let alone a nutritious meal, may not be accessible.
Disparities in the cost of living in different areas. It's very expensive to live in the Toronto area. It would be less expensive to live in, say, Regina. So the issue of minimal wage, this is important. We see a growing poverty. We see poverty in Canada largely along the lines of, Native people are at an extreme disadvantage in the economy.
Canada's minority groups, including the indigenous populations, are now facing greater challenges. For example, overcrowding in housing makes social distancing, self-isolation, or quarantining an issue.
Far more heavily incarcerated. They go to jail at a much higher rate than blacks in the United States.
In northern remote isolated and urban indigenous communities, there may be 10 people living in a space designed for 2 or 3. Housing in disrepair also serves to support transmission of respiratory illnesses.
The resource-based economy, especially oil and gas. Oil and gas is very difficult. The price of oil and gas is very low. And there's been a great emphasis on building pipelines from the Alberta tar sands across the mountains so that the bitumen can be shipped to China.
Okay, today we have a special guest joining us for this edition of the program. His name, Robert Hugo. He's the spokesman for the Committee for the Republic of Canada, Canada Liaison for Schiller Institute. He was also a contributor to the Canadian Patriot, News from the Northern Front, the edition which focused on Canada's struggle for nationhood and the Round Table movement. Robert Hugo, welcome to Economic Divide. First question, before the pandemic, Canada's economic indicators, they weren't that great, and now the pandemic has obviously affected the economy severely. The real GDP, according to one report, has fallen 18% in the 2 months, which none of the other 4 recessions actually even came close. Is that how bad Canada's economy is doing at this point?
Yes, well, what you're describing is this is not particular to Canada. All of the G7 countries were hit quite hard by the pandemic. Now, I think the question that should be asked is why were certain Asian countries, and particularly why was China able to deal with this pandemic so much better than the G7 nations, for example? Because this, in late December of 2019 was a disease that was not clearly defined what it was. Very rapidly, China took the emergency measures so that that by the end of February, they had, using public health measures and a huge mobilization, they had gotten the pandemic under control.
In terms of Canada's wages, there have been doubts that it has actually led to income inequality. Are Canadians not earning enough to actually cover their expenses? For example, Canada's rate per hour wage is $13.01, yet in Ontario, the rate is calculated to be at least $15.40 per hour.
Well, first off, the late economist Lyndon LaRouche emphasized that the only competent approach to economics is from the standpoint of what he calls physical economics. And in physical economics, you do not take as primary money, You do not take as primary even, for example, a factory producing X number million tons of widgets per year. What you take as primary is the entire national economy, and on the larger scale, the entire world. And the question that a physical economist has to answer is what are the measures that have to be taken by, for example, the government of my country in collaboration with the government of other countries around the world to ensure that 50 years from now, mankind is positioned to be able to meet the challenges that we will surely meet. The publication put out by Lyndon LaRouche's associates called the Executive Intelligence Review produced a special report at the end of May of this year entitled The LaRouche Program to Reopen the Economy. The World Needs 1.5 billion productive jobs. And it said if you take the figures that have been provided by the International Labor Organization, using figures from 2019, the world population is about 7.7 billion people. The labor force of the world is roughly 3.5 billion people. Now, if you look at the number of those 3.5 billion people who are employed in what's called formal jobs, formal employment, and you add to that the number of people that are employed in the informal economy, you're looking at roughly then beyond that the number of people that are unemployed, and a fourth category, the number of people who might get a paycheck or might be collecting money, but are not doing anything of productive value for their nation or the world. For example, people selling cigarettes on a street corner, or what they call in the United States or Canada the gig economy. This could even include things such as hotels, restaurants, things that are not physically productive. And by productive, Mr. LaRouche means the production of the food, the raw materials, the intermediate goods required to physically reproduce the ability to maintain the existing human population and allow for growth.
Final question, poverty, another economic indicator that's not going the right direction for Canada. February 2020, a report has said that the 2018 income tax return saying that 3.2 million Canadians were living below the poverty line. Discrimination and systemic inequality rather than the lack of or poor individual choice to be the main reasons. Why is this the case, especially among the indigenous, the visible minority, immigrants, and single-parent families?
Well, first off, as I said, you have to sort of look at this from a higher standpoint. One of the things that began occurring from the 1971 takedown of the Bretton Woods system on was the development at a later point of these free trade agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Act. Our organization put out a special report at that time entitled Auschwitz Below the Border, referring to the U.S.-Mexican border, because you were essentially creating conditions where people who were working in the United States at a certain higher wage associated with a skilled trade, these jobs fled to Mexico or eventually other places, including China at one point. Based on this idea, which is a British outlook of economics, the way to get wealthy according to the British imperial outlook is to buy something cheap and sell it very expensively. And if you control finance, if you can control transportation networks and so forth, that's the way that you supposedly get wealthy. But that precisely is the model that is now broken down. The coronavirus pandemic just exposed the underlying dysfunction of the entire world economy because of that. And so I think that we should be, if we were prepared to work with China and look at what they have actually done, just recently, China has announced that the last remains of extreme poverty in China have now been eliminated. It's not that people are not poor in China, because they're talking about absolute poverty. But how did they do this? They did this through, in some cases, if people are living in mountainous, remote regions, it's very difficult to deal with the situation. They would move them to an area where they could get a productive employment. And Canada, as well as the United States, could learn some lessons from that kind of approach.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much for that. Robert Hugo, the spokesman for the Committee for the Republic of Canada. All right, it's time for a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere. We have plenty more coming up in the next half of the program. Current affairs and impact analyst Mohan will be joining us. He will share with us some posts such as wealth tax. Could that be the answer to Canada's economic woes? Also look at how employment losses were greater for younger, low-wage, and non-unionized workers in Canada. And finally, a look at gender gap in the next half, and surprisingly how race plays an important role in income inequality.
Kill a military scientist, try to create a vacuum in his country, and at the same time provoke it into war. Was it Israel trying to get Iran into war with the US? Watch Iran Today for more on the assassination of this scientist, Fakhrizadeh, and what it might ensue.
Hello, welcome back to Economic Divide. This is our in-depth section. When it comes to income inequality, the basic question we are asking is Canada becoming more unequal? We're going to set out to show you the three findings that we came up with. First is income inequality to have increased over the past 20 years. Second, richest group increased its share of total national income while the poorest group lost its share. And finally, we're going to take a look at how Canadians in the poorest income group still saw their income levels rise, albeit minimally. Okay. Now, the report titled The Affordability Education, written in 2019, discusses the rising concern about how the cost of living in Canada and how it presents a threat and opportunity to progressives, a report commissioned by the Broadbent Institute. Going on to what we thought was important, here you can see 1 in 4 Canadians cite financial issues, taxes, or housing as the thing keeping them up at night. Moving on to the next, cost of living, housing affordability, wages, inequality, and taxes. Well, these are things that are actually vote drivers. 57% rank an issue tied to the cost of living, wages, or taxes as their top issues. Moving on to the next finding that we have here, almost half of Canadians are worried about their cost of living. It's broken it down, asking a question how worried Canadians are, and it says women are more worried than men. Concern crosses all age groups, however, and that worry is directly related to household income. So we can see how household income obviously has an effect when it comes to the economy. And here, again, cost of living, in terms of how worried Canadians are about it, it's broken it down to the level of income from $35,000 moving upwards, 35 to 50, 50 to 75, all the way up to 150,000 K. And of course, you can see the trend that exists here. And what this means is that, well, Canadians are worried about their cost of living. They want to have enough income to pay for things that they want in life, things such as rent, such as everyday costs. While most Canadians feel that the cost of living and income inequality has gotten worse over the past few years, they don't think that corporate profits have been hurt. In fact, 73% believe that corporate profits have actually improved or stayed about the same over the past few years.
The economic pain in Canada has not been evenly distributed. In a report published by 4 Canadian economists, it was revealed that employment losses were greater for younger, low-wage, and non-unionized workers, with public-facing sectors like retail and restaurants to have been hit the hardest. Previous analyses have shown that women are being disproportionately affected. The report showed that the labor market impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been harsher on those workers who hold the least bargaining power.
Free fall. And it's largely created by government forcing on the public lockdowns, locking down our societies, our businesses. People can't go out to eat, can't do the usual things. This is, it seems it's being purposely done according to some agenda that seeks to destroy the economy.
Time now to bring in Mohan Abedin. He is our current affairs and impact analyst who joins us in the studios. Mohan, welcome.
Thank you.
So you have some posts that you want to share with us?
Absolutely, and they are focused on Canada. Of course, Canada is struggling with pretty much the same financial woes that much of the Western world is grappling with, including the US. So here, focus on progressive wealth tax would provide that amount of funds to fight wealth inequality. Again, sounds very good in theory, but how practical are these plans? We all know that tax regimes are very hard to design and even harder to implement. So yeah, this tweet strikes me with being made with very good intentions. I'm just not sure how practical it is.
Well, it shows how important inequality overall and wealth inequality in particular is when they have to, or when they're thinking about a wealth tax.
Well, you know, with Canada, it's always framed as this progressive country in North America, especially in relation to the US. But in reality, though, it's suffering from, broadly speaking, the same structural, financial, fiscal issues as the US is, but on a much smaller scale, obviously, given its size. So there's hardly anything progressive about Canada from a financial point of view.
Okay, let's move on to the next tweet here.
Sure. So, you know, impact of the pandemic. You know, again, similar issues we see in America: foreign workers, immigrants, refugees, international students. So, you know, this shows you the problems Canada is grappling with, but it doesn't really give you any solutions.
Well, it's hard to look at this and not think about whether this might be also pointing towards the fact that perhaps there's discrimination when it comes to foreign workers, immigrants, refugees, and international
Again,
students.
that goes back to the heart of what I said earlier. Canada is often projected as this progressive place, but in reality it's replete with racism, discrimination, as the US is. Right, so, you know.
Okay, the last tweet that you have for us?
Sure, so this is coming from Maxime Bernier. This is coming from a different angle now, basically a right-wing angle, accusing others of being, you know, left-wing politicos, that, you know, their job is not to fight inequalities, to save the Canadian dollar. To me, this speaks of the very hard battles so-called Canadian progressive have in terms of reforming their country's financial fiscal system. They're grappling with that kind of mentality, which is a very American one. It's kind of right-wing in fiscal terms, super capitalism, free markets, and most important of all, low taxation.
That's right. Thank you so much for that.
You're
we
welcome.
always appreciate your input. Mohan Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst. Okay, our next focus is the gender gap and how race plays a factor in income inequality in Canada. Do stay with us.
Culture of inequality continues to persist in Canada's capital market sector, and the brunt of it is felt by women and people who are racialized, indigenous, or other minority groups. According to a study of 600 Canadian finance workers conducted by Women in Capital Markets in 2019, only half of women believe that they were treated equally and to have the same access to opportunities as other genders at their firm, and just a third thought their company is free from gender bias, that the promotion process was fair and objective. The study revealed that black women were the least likely to say that they were treated equally by their firm and manager, and the least likely to perceive that they have equal career opportunities.
Canada's economy has been battered by the COVID-19 pandemic. That much is definitely known. But the current problems are also an outcome of poor economic policies from the past. We need to mention the First Nation people and how their rights have been violated, along with how they have been deprived of reaping the benefits of what the Canadian economy has to offer. What has Canada done for them recently? And finally, Canada needs to address its inequality issues soon in order to not have this be another virus on top of the coronavirus that has plagued its people and society. That's all the time we have for this week's episode. We hope you've enjoyed the show. You can watch this episode of ED again by logging on to our website and clicking on shows, where our on-demand service is just a click away. So make sure you check it out. On behalf of myself, Kavatapway, and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching, stay safe, and see you again next time.